Imagine, just for a moment, that you drifted off to sleep in your own bed and awoke not to the buzz of electricity or the glow of a screen, but to the dim light of a smoking hearth. The room around you is small, the walls of rough wood and plaster, the air thick with the scent of straw, damp earth, and old smoke. The blanket on your body scratches like burlap, and when you rise, your feet find not polished floorboards but uneven dirt. You are not dreaming, you have woken in the Middle Ages. The first thing you notice is the silence. No hum of machines, no distant cars, no voices from radios or televisions. Instead, you hear only the faint rustle of wind against the thatch above you, the creak of timber as it shifts, and perhaps, from somewhere close, the muffled bleating of a goat. It feels eerily quiet, and yet this quiet was the constant music of medieval life. The bed you rose from is nothing more than a wooden frame stuffed with straw, lumpy and alive with tiny movements you'd rather not think about. The blanket is coarse wool. It smells faintly rancid with sweat and smoke. A single small window, no glass, only a shutter lets and a thin blade of morning light. Through it, you glimpse gray mist clinging to the fields. You stumble outside, ducking beneath the low doorway, and the cold air bites at your face. The village is before you, a cluster of huts, each as crooked and weary as its inhabitants. Smoke seeps from holes in the roofs, children scurry barefoot through the mud, and chickens peck at whatever scraps they can find. Beyond, fields stretch out, brown and hard from the frost. At the far end of the valley, a church spire juts into the sky, and high above it all, on a distant hill, the dark silhouette of a castle watches over everything like a stone sentinel. This is the world you've woken into, a world without engines, without electricity, without even the certainty of tomorrow, a world where survival depends on your hands, your neighbors, and the mercy of weather you cannot control. The village begins to stir as the sun rises higher, though the sun itself is a weak, pale thing behind the clouds. Men and women move slowly, their faces hollow, their shoulders stoop, as though the weight of centuries already rests on them. In truth, for most, life is short. Few here will live past 40, and many children will never see their 12th winter. Death is as common as birth, and both are accepted with the same weary resignation. Breakfast, if one can call it that, has already been eaten, a thin gruel of oats or barley, if the harvest has been kind. A crust of bread is hard as stone, if it is not. Meat is rare, a treasure reserved for holy days or stolen hunts. Most days, the peasants survive on vegetables, legumes, and whatever scraps they can coax from their small gardens. Salted fish may appear in some homes, but fresh fish, milk, and butter are luxuries, often claimed by the Lord's men before the villagers can taste them. Their clothing is as rough as their meals. The men wear tunics of coarse wool or linen, stained and patched so many times that the original color is lost. The women's dresses are simple, belted with rope, their hair hidden beneath kerchiefs or veils that smell of smoke. Shoes, when they exist at all, are clumsy leather things, cracked and stiff. Many children run barefoot, their feet hardened by dirt and frost. The work never ends. As soon as the light is strong enough to see by, men take their tools and trudge into the fields. The soil is poor, heavy clay that resists every thrust of the plow. Oxen groan under their yokes, urged forward by tired hands. Women follow behind, scattering seed with practiced motions, whispering small prayers that the sky will give rain, but not too much, sun, but not too fiercely. Children, too small to work the heavy tools, gather sticks for firewood or chase crows from the crops. Their shouts thin against the endless sky. Disease lurks everywhere. A scratch can fester and kill. A cough can spread through the cottages like fire, claiming old and young alike. No one speaks of medicine, for medicine is a word that belongs to monks in monasteries, far away, with their books and their prayers. Here in the village, remedies are simple: garlic, herbs, whispered charms against evil spirits. Whether they heal or not, no one knows. Hope is often stronger than the cure, yet, despite the hunger, the toil, In the constant shadow of death, there are moments of laughter. A boy tumbles into the mud, and the others jeer before helping him up. A woman hums while she kneads bread, her voice carrying faintly over the fields. In the evenings, when the day's work is done and the sky burns with the last light of the sun, neighbors gather in one another's cottages. They tell stories of saints and devils, of kings and battles no one here has ever seen, of wonders that may or may not be true. And for a little while, the fire is warmer, the bread tastes sweeter, and the world feels less cruel. This is peasant life in the Middle Ages, relentless labor, fragile survival, but also stubborn endurance. A life measured not in years, but in seasons. Life in the medieval village followed the rhythm of the seasons. Spring was a time of desperate labor, for seeds had to be sown before the rains passed, and every able body, from children to the elderly, was dragged into the fields. Summer brought long days of weeding and tending the crops, sweat streaming down backs as the sun baked the earth. Autumn was the harvest, a frantic rush to gather every last stalk of grain, every root, before frost arrived. Winter was the cruel judge. When the barns emptied, the stores thinned, and hunger sat at every table like an unwelcome guest. A good harvest meant survival. A bad harvest meant death, not for one family, but for many. In such times, villagers whispered that God was angry or that witches had spoiled the crops. Some turned to charms, hanging dried herbs over doors. Others trudged to the church, begging the priest for blessings. But no prayer could guarantee a full-bellied. Festivals were the rare escape from endless toil. On feast days, the village gathered in the square. Rough bread and ale were shared, sometimes a pig roasted, if the Lord allowed. Fiddlers scraped at strings, and men danced with heavy steps while women clapped in rhythm. Children spun until they tumbled into the dirt, laughing. For a single night, hunger was forgotten, replaced by song and firelight. Yet even then, the presence of the Lord's steward loomed, counting barrels of ale, weighing the offerings, ensuring the Lord's share was never overlooked. Marriage, too, was more necessity than romance. A union meant another pair of hands in the field, another womb for children who might survive to carry the work onward. Weddings were simple, a blessing from the priest, an exchange of bread or ale, perhaps a dance. Love was a luxury, and few could afford it. Still, in the quiet of night, when candles guttered low and the smell of smoke hung in the rafters, young couples whispered dreams of something gentler. Even if those dreams faded with the dawn, fear was constant, and it wore many faces. Fear of hunger, fear of wolves in the forest, fear of soldiers marching through, demanding supplies or worse. But above all was fear of displeasing the Lord. The castle on the hill was not only stone, it was power made visible. If rents were not paid, if grain was withheld, punishment came swiftly. A man might lose his land, his animals, even his freedom. The lash and the stocks were common lessons in obedience. The church stood as the other pillar of life. Its spire was the finger pointing to heaven, its bells the voice that ruled time. The priest told the villagers what was sin and what was salvation. Few could read, fewer still dared to question. For many, the church was both comfort and threat, the promise of heaven, and the warning of hellfire. So passed the years of a peasant, a cycle of work and want, hope and despair, laughter and loss. Their names seldom entered chronicles, yet their hands built the world upon which castles, cathedrals, and kingdoms rested. If the peasant's world was mud, smoke, and toil, the castle represented something entirely different: stone, power, and fear. Rising on hills or cliffs, castles were not built for beauty, but for dominance. Their gray walls loomed over valleys, visible for miles, reminding every farmer and traveler of who ruled the land. To live in the shadow of a castle was to live in the shadow of authority, unyielding and absolute. The approach to such a fortress was designed to crush hope. Narrow paths wound uphill, forcing attackers to climb slowly while arrows rained down. A drawbridge guarded the entrance, lifted at the slightest threat. Beyond it lay a gatehouse lined with murder holes, gaps in the ceiling from which boiling water, stones, or burning pitch could be poured on intruders. Every stone, every tower, every iron portcullis was a statement. Here, power is safe. Here, rebellion dies. Inside, life was not all feasting and grandeur. Though the stories often suggested, lords and ladies lived surrounded by luxury compared to their peasants. But luxury was relative. Drafts swept through the great hall, where rushes on the floor quickly grew foul with scraps and bones. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, dogs, sweat, and spilled ale. Torches lit the stone, but they gave more soot than light still. For the people of the Middle Ages, the great hall was a place of awe. Long tables stretched the length of the room, laden on feast days with roasted meats, bread, and flagons of wine. Minstrels sang of battles and saints, while jugglers and fools entertained the Lord's guests. At the high table, raised above the rest, the Lord and Lady presided like monarchs in miniature. To be invited to dine, there was a privilege beyond price. Knights formed the backbone of the castle's strength. From the age of 7, boys of noble birth were sent away to train, first as pages, then as squires. Their days were filled with drilling, tending horses, polishing armor, and learning the codes of chivalry, loyalty, honor, defense of the church. By the time they were knighted, often in a ceremony heavy with ritual, they were expected to fight, to kill, and to die for their lord without hesitation. Tournaments offered a spectacle between wars. Knights thundered across fields on massive destriers. Lances aimed at splintering upon their opponents' shields. Crowds roared, ladies waved kerchiefs, and bards immortalized the victors in song. Yet behind the glitter lay danger. Bones broke, skulls cracked, men died. For all the talk of honor, tournaments were as bloody as battle. War was the true test. Castles were both homes and fortresses, and when war came, they became prisons of stone. Siege was a terror like no other. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, while defenders watched supplies dwindle and disease spread. Arrows, stones from trebuchets, fire hurled from catapults, all fell relentlessly. The smell of rot, the cries of the wounded, the taste of fear in every mouth. This was the other side of chivalry still. The castle remained the symbol of the age. It was the stage upon which power displayed itself. Marriages sealed alliances, oaths were sworn. Judgments passed. Within its walls, lords and ladies played their games of politics, while outside, peasants bent beneath the weight of their demands. The castle was not only a fortress of stone, but a fortress of hierarchy, built to endure not just enemies but centuries. The castle was more than stone. It was a stage upon which countless lives played their parts. Behind the thick walls, power and survival intertwined. And for every knight in shining armor, there were servants, cooks, guards, and stable boys who toiled in shadows. A boy named Hugh, son of a minor noble, entered this world at the age of 7. Taken from his family, he was sent to serve as a page in the household of a great lord. His days began before dawn, carrying water, tending to fires, cleaning boots caked with mud. He learned to ride small ponies, to carry messages, and to recite prayers. At night, he watched the knights at table, their laughter loud, their armor gleaming, their hands heavy on the shoulders of the serving women. Hugh dreamed of the day when he too might hold a sword, when his name might be sung by minstrels. But for now, he was little more than a shadow in their hall. Years passed, and Hugh became a squire. He rose with the knights, helped them into their heavy mail and plate, polished shields until they mirrored firelight. He drilled in the yard, bruises blooming across his arms, blisters tearing his hands. He learned the weight of a lance, the recoil of a sword striking steel. He also learned fear, of his master's anger, of the horse that could throw him, of the enemy he might one day face. Chivalry was not golden light and poetry. It was sweat, blood, and obedience. At last came the day of knighthood. The great hall was hung with banners, the floor strewn with fresh rushes. Hugh knelt before his lord, a sword laid across his shoulders. Words were spoken of loyalty, honor, the defense of the church. The flat of the blade touched each shoulder, and then Hugh rose, Sir Hugh now, a knight in name and duty. The crowd cheered, and yet inside him, he felt the crushing weight of what it meant. He was bound to fight, to bleed, to serve until death. Soon after, war tested him. The castle was besieged, its walls bombarded by great stones hurled from trebuchets. Fires licked the rooftops, arrows hissed like angry hornets. Hugh fought on the walls, his shield splintering under blows, his arm trembling from the weight of his sword. He watched men he knew fall screaming into the moat, watched flames devour the stables, smelled the sickly stench of blood and burning flesh. Heroism felt hollow in that smoke-choked air. When at last the enemy withdrew, the survivors staggered from the walls. The Lord held a feast to celebrate, but the tables groaned with less food than before. Bread was stale, wine watered down, and in the shadows of the hall, widows wept for husbands who would not return. Hugh sat among his brothers in arms, his armor dented, his hands raw. He understood then that the songs of knights told only half the story. The rest was silence, grief, and scars still. Tournaments and pageantry continued. On bright summer days, the fields outside the castle filled with color. Pennants snapped in the wind, drums thundered, and knights paraded in glittering armor. Hugh rode among them now, his horse a massive destrier clad in barding, his lance steady. The crowd cheered, ladies tossed flowers, and for a brief moment, the life of a knight looked glorious. But he knew too well that behind every splintered lance lay broken bones. Behind every roar of the crowd lay the memory of screams and war. The castle remained. Its stones weathered storms, its walls endured fire, and within it the cycle continued. Pages became squires, squires became knights, knights became lords, and all the while, peasants tilled the soil below, paying for the splendor above with their sweat and hunger. The castle was not only a fortress of stone, but a fortress of memory, holding within its halls the laughter of feasts and the cries of dying men alike. If the castle was the fortress of power, the church was the fortress of the soul. Its shadow stretched across every life in medieval Europe, from the poorest shepherd to the mightiest king. The stone spires that pierced the sky were not merely architecture but symbols, reminders that God's gaze was constant, that heaven and hell lay closer than breath. For the peasant, the church was both fear and comfort. Bells tolled to mark the hours of labor and prayer. The priest's voice defined sin and salvation, often in words few could fully grasp. Most villagers could not read or write. Latin prayers were as mysterious as the stars above. Yet they bowed their heads, crossed themselves, and trusted that obedience might buy them mercy in the next life. If not in this one, inside the church, the air was thick with incense. The light dimmed through stained glass, casting saints and devils in shifting colors upon the floor. To step into such a place was to step out of the mud and smoke of daily life, into a vision of eternity. Paintings showed Christ's suffering, Mary's compassion, demons gnawing on sinners in hell. Children stared wide-eyed, their imaginations scarred and shaped by these holy warnings. Monasteries were the engines of knowledge. Behind high walls, monks copied books by hand, each letter a prayer against forgetting. Hours were spent in silence, punctuated only by chants and the scratching of quills. Meals were plain, bread, beans, and ale. Sleep was short, broken by night vigils. To an outsider, it seemed a life of hardship, but to the monks, it was a fortress against the chaos of the world, a place where they could serve God in discipline and order. Pilgrimages carried faith beyond village walls. Men and women took to the roads, walking hundreds of miles to reach holy shrines. Some limped with canes, others carried the bones of the dead to rest in sacred soil. On the road, they begged for bread, slept under hedges, endured thieves and storms. Yet the promise of relics, the hope of miracles, the belief that each step erased sins, these drove them onward. To reach Santiago, Canterbury, or Rome was to touch eternity with blistered feet. Not all believed blindly. Whispers of heresy rose, carried by wandering preachers who dared to question the wealth of bishops or the corruption of priests. They spoke of a Christ who lived poor, of a church that should not feast while peasants starved. Such voices were dangerous. The church branded them heretics, and flames often silenced their words. Yet in the ashes, questions smoldered. Faith was a constant, as real as the soil or the seasons. It bound the people, it frightened them, it gave them hope when famine came, when plague spread, when soldiers marched. To doubt was perilous, but to believe was survival. The church did not simply tell them what to think, it told them what to be. If villages were the bones of medieval life, cities were its restless heart. They rose from crossroads and rivers, from places where trade could thrive. And soon their walls pressed tight around a jumble of houses, markets, churches, and workshops. A medieval city was not like the orderly towns we know today. It was a labyrinth of crooked alleys, crowded squares, and smells that struck long before you reached the gates. The first thing a traveler noticed was the noise. Blacksmiths hammered at anvils, vendors shouted their prices, children shrieked in play. Pigs squealed as they were dragged through the mud. Carts creaked, wheels splashing through puddles that were more filth than water. The air was a mixture of roasting meat, horse dung, tan leather, and human sweat. It was overwhelming. But to those who lived there, it was life itself. Markets were the lifeblood of the city. Here, peasants brought surplus grain. Fishermen displayed their catches still glistening with scales, and merchants spread out cloth dyed in colors that seemed to glow compared to the dull browns of peasant tunics. Spices, cinnamon, pepper, saffron perfumed the air, so rare and precious that a pouch of them could buy a goat. Coins clinked, hands argued over prices, and pickpockets slipped silently through the crowd like fish in a stream. Guilds gave shape to this chaos. Every trade, bakers, cobblers, weavers, masons, had its guild, and no one could simply set up a stall without belonging to one. Apprentices began young, sometimes at 10, sweeping floors, carrying water, grinding tools. Slowly they learned the craft, their hands toughening, their backs bending. After years of service, they became journeymen, free to travel and work for wages. Only a few would rise to be masters, allowed to open their own workshops and take apprentices in turn. Consider William, the son of a shoemaker. From dawn to dusk he bent over leather, cutting, stitching, hammering soles into place. His hands were calloused, his fingernails black with dye. He dreamed of becoming a master, of hanging a sign above his own door. But each year the guild demanded fees, the market grew harsher, and the lord's taxes bit deeper. Sometimes William wondered if his children would inherit shoes or only the ache of his labor. Cities were also crossroads of ideas. Wandering preachers, minstrels, and merchants carried stories from far-off lands. In taverns, men argued about kings and wars, about rumors from France or the Holy Land. Knowledge traveled in these narrow streets as surely as goods did. Yet so did disease. Crowded houses, open sewers, rotting waste, all were perfect breeding grounds for plague. A single cough could sweep through an entire quarter, leaving death in its wake at night. The city did not sleep easily. Torches flickered on street corners, casting more shadow than light. Thieves prowled, and watchmen clattered by with halberds, calling out the hours. The rich retreated behind locked doors of stone, while the poor curled up on straw in alleys. Rats squeaked through the gutters, fat from scraps. Somewhere, a drunk sang a hymn to the Virgin, his voice cracking against the walls. Yet despite the filth, despite the dangers, cities pulse with opportunity. A clever merchant might rise to wealth beyond the dreams of peasants. A skilled craftsman could feed his family better than the fields ever allowed. And above all, the city offered freedom of a kind, not from hunger or hardship, but from the suffocating grip of the manor and the lord. Here, among the clamor and chaos, people began to shape new lives, new ambitions, and slowly, a new world. The merchants gambled with Omas, son of a wool trader, grew up among bales of fleece stacked high in a narrow house by the river. From childhood, he learned the art of bargaining, how to flatter, how to threaten, how to smile while hiding calculation behind his eyes. By 20, he had already taken wagons to the next county, borrowing wool for wine and salt. But his ambition stretched further. One spring, Thomas joined a caravan bound for Flanders, where English wool was prized like gold. The journey took weeks. Roads dissolved into mud, bridges collapsed under heavy carts, and bandits prowled the forests. Yet the caravan pressed on, torches lighting their path at night, bells on the horses jingling through the dark. At last they reached Bruges, a city so vast it seemed endless. There Thomas saw stalls overflowing with silk from Italy, spices from the east, silver from German mines. The air was thick with shouting in a dozen languages. He sold his wool for a fortune, more than his father had ever seen, and returned with cloth dyed scarlet, a color so bright it seemed to burn in the sunlight. Back home, peasants stared in wonder, for scarlet was the color of nobility. Thomas knew he had crossed a line. He was no longer merely a trader. He was becoming part of a class that could rival knights and lords with coin instead of steel. But with wealth came enemies, jealous rivals, greedy officials, and lords who saw in every successful merchant a threat to their power. The apprentice's triumphant all stories glittered with success. John, a baker's apprentice, rose each morning long before the sun. His master demanded loaves ready at dawn, when servants of the wealthy came to buy bread for their households. John kneaded dough until his arms burned, sweat dripping into flour-dusted troughs. For years he endured scolding, blows, and endless work, hoping one day to earn his place as a journeyman. But his master was harsh, keeping apprentices longer than custom allowed, forcing them to labor without pay. John began to dream of escape. One night, after a quarrel, he fled, hiding among vagabonds outside the walls. For weeks he begged scraps, his clothes turning to rags, yet without a guild. He was nothing, no right to bake, no right to work. At last, hungry and desperate, he returned, throwing himself at the mercy of his master. Such was the power of the guilds. Freedom was promised, but only if the master permitted. Many apprentices grew old without ever rising higher, their youth spent in sweat and servitude. The woman of the street sat at the edge of the market square lived Marjorie, known by all yet truly known by none. She sold her body for coins, sometimes for bread. The church condemned her, but men who wore crosses still found their way to her bed. She lived in a narrow room above a tavern, where straw served as both bed and floor. Her life was a cycle of hunger and survival. Yet Marjorie possessed a kind of freedom rare for women of her time. She had no husband to command her, no lord to own her labor. She knew secrets of men who preached virtue by day and sought her at night. Those secrets were her shield. When plague swept the quarter, she tended the sick, unafraid of death. Perhaps she thought her soul already condemned. Perhaps she believed God's mercy might yet be greater than the priest's scorn. The city watchman in every city needed order, and it fell to men like Robert, a watchman with a halberd and a lantern. His nights were spent walking narrow streets, calling the hours. Past midnight, all's well. Yet not all was well. He dragged drunks from taverns, broke up knife fights, and chased thieves through alleys slick with waste. His pay was poor, his danger constant. More than once he stood helpless before a fire devouring a row of houses, unable to fight the flames with nothing but buckets of water. Still, Robert wore his badge with pride. In a world where most men bowed their heads, he carried authority. The poor cursed him, the rich ignored him, but he stood between them all. And when dawn broke and the bells of the cathedral rang, Robert knew the city would wake again. Noisy, filthy, alive. The cities pulsed together. These lives formed the rhythm of the medieval city. Merchants chasing fortune across seas, apprentices trapped in endless toil, women surviving in shadows, guards patrolling under flickering torchlight. All played their part in the great human symphony. The city was a place of danger, and hope, squalor and ambition, decay and rebirth. For the peasant who entered its gates for the first time, it was a world beyond imagination. For those who lived within, it was the only world that mattered. The shadow of death no force shaped medieval life so deeply as disease. Famine could starve a village, war could burn a town. The plague swept across kingdoms like a black tide. None was more feared than the great mortality, the Black Death. When it came, it moved with a speed and cruelty that defied reason. One week a city thrived, the next its streets were lined with cars of corpses. The signs were unmistakable. First a fever, then swellings, great black buboes under arms and in the groin, painful as fire. Then came the cough, blood bubbling from the lungs. Few survived more than a few days. To see a neighbor healthy at dawn and buried by dusk was no rare thing. Fear gripped every soul. Some believed the air itself was poison, carrying invisible death on the wind. Others whispered that it was God's punishment for sins, a cleansing fire upon a wicked world. Still others blamed outsiders, strangers, travelers, Jews, and mobs turned to violence, desperate for someone to blame. A village in Silenstein, a small village by the river. Life ended in days. The miller's wife fell first, her body trembling, her skin blotched with purple. Soon after, the miller himself collapsed in the dust of his yard. Their children scattered, some fleeing to the forest, some taken in by neighbors. Though soon the neighbors began to cough. The priest rang the bell for the dead so often that his iron tongue cracked. At first he read prayers at every grave, but when the bodies came faster, he could only mutter words as pits were filled. At last, he himself took sick, his voice fading with the toll of the bell. After that, silence swallowed the village. The few who lived through it found themselves in a hollow world. Fields lay unplowed. Houses stood empty, doors swinging in the wind. Wolves prowled the streets where children had once played. The monk's burdened brother Matthew, a monk of a great abbey, kept record of the plague. By candlelight he wrote, day upon day, the carts bring more dead. We lay them in trenches without shroud or prayer, for there are too many. I have seen novices fall while chanting, their voices breaking into coughs that never ceased. God's mercy feels far from these walls. The monastery had once been a fortress of learning, its library rich with books, its scriptorium filled with quills scratching across parchment. Now its cloisters echoed with coughing, its dormitory stank of sickness. Monks who had vowed obedience and silence broke into cries of terror at night, begging for deliverance. Some said Matthew survived only because he burned herbs in his chamber, or because he washed more often than others. He himself believed it was chance, or perhaps God's decision that he should remain to write what he had seen. His chronicle would outlive him, a testimony to a world drowned in death. The doctor in the mask in cities. Doctors walked the streets in beak masks stuffed with herbs, rosemary, lavender, vinegar-soaked sponges. Their black robes and glass eyes made them look like carrion birds. They carried sticks to prod patients, fearing to touch them with bare hands. Few trusted these men, for cures were scarce and often cruel, bloodletting, burning sores with irons, or forcing the sick to drink potions of mercury and ground gems. One such doctor, Master Alain of Paris, kept his distance from the dying, but still he watched as families dragged their kin to pits, wailing. He admitted to a friend that he did not expect to survive himself. We are not healers, he said, only witnesses to ruin. A mother's grief, Margaret, a weaver's wife, lost her husband in the first week. Her two sons followed within days. She carried them herself to the cart that took the dead to the pits outside the walls. Her arms trembled, but her tears had run dry. Her daughter, barely 5 years old, sick in necks. Margaret knelt at her side, stroking her hair as fever burned the child's body. Sleep, little one, she whispered, though she knew the child would not wake. When at last the girl's breath ceased, Margaret lay beside her and closed her eyes. By morning, neighbors found them both still, death having granted the mercy life denied. The aftermath when the Black Death passed, it left Europe transformed. Entire villages vanished, swallowed by weeds and silence. Fields lay fallow, harvests rotted, and lords found themselves with too few peasants to work their lands. Survivors demanded higher wages, more freedom, for they had seen death and would no longer bow as before. Some lords resisted with lash and chain, but the old order cracked. Faith was shaken. Many asked how a merciful God could allow such horror. Others turned more fervent, joining flagellants who marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for the world's sins. Hope and despair wrestled in every soul. The plague did not end with one wave. It returned again and again for centuries. Yet humanity endured. Children were born, crops were sown, bells rang once more. The scars remain, carved into memory, into stone, into chronicles. But life, stubborn as grass between stones, rose again. The drumbeat of war medieval Europe was never far from war. Borders shifted like sand in the wind. Kings quarreled, dukes rebelled, and neighbors fought over land, water, and honor. For peasants, war was not banners and glory, but fire in the night and strangers demanding bread at sword point. For knights, it was both duty and ambition, a chance to prove valor, to win spoils, or to die in mud with no songs sung for them. The call to arms came suddenly. Messengers rode through villages, trumpets sounded, and lords summoned their vassals. Men who had never traveled farther than the market found themselves handed spears and told to march. Families wept at crossroads as fathers, sons, and brothers vanished into the dust of the road. The young knight's first battle, he, newly knighted, dreamed of honor. He rode out with his lord, banners streaming, sunlight flashing on steel. He pictured himself striking down foes, his name carried in ballads. But when battle came, it was not like the stories. The field was chaos. Arrows hissed down like rain. Men screamed. Horses reared, mud sucked at boots. Hugh lowered his lance, the shock of impact shattering wood in his hands. He swung his sword and felt it bite, not against armor, but in the flesh. Blood sprayed hot across his face. For a moment he froze, horrified. The man he struck gurgled and fell, his eyes wide. Hugh's stomach churned. He wanted to vomit, but the press of men drove him onward. By nightfall, the field was a graveyard. Bodies lay tangled in the mud, groans rising from the dying. Hugh staggered among them, his armor dented, his soul torn. The songs of knights had not told of this stench, this terror, this emptiness. He understood then that war was not honor. It was endurance, to fight, to survive, to carry scars that never faded. The peasants wore not only knights fought. When lords quarreled, peasants were dragged into their wars. A farmer named Stephen left his plow to march with a wooden spear. He wore no armor, only a padded coat. On the field, he stood shoulder to shoulder with other villagers, their faces pale with fear. When the knights charged, Stephen's spear shook in his hands. Horses thundered like storm clouds, the ground trembling beneath their hooves. He braced the shaft as he had been told, and by chance it caught a horse's chest. The beast screamed, tumbling down, its rider thrown. For one instant Stephen thought himself a hero. Then another rider struck him down, sword biting through his collarbone. His story ended in the mud, unmarked, unnamed, like thousands of others. Fire and pillage for those left behind. War was fire. Soldiers, hungry and unpaid, raided villages. They seized grain, slaughtered animals, dragged women into barns. The cries of children mingled with the crackle of burning roofs. Lords called it foraging. Peasants called it ruin. A widow named Alice watched her cottage burn, her children clinging to her skirts. She had nothing left but ashes. War did not ask her to march, but it took her all the same. The call of the cross by on local wars came the great summons, the crusades. Priests thundered from pulpits, promising forgiveness of sins to those who bore the cross. Crowds wept and cheered, men tearing strips from cloaks to stitch red crosses on their tunics. To fight in the Holy Land was to serve God himself, to win eternal life. Knights sold land. Peasants abandoned fields. Women sent husbands and sons across seas they had never seen. Caravans of pilgrims and soldiers wound through Europe, banners high, songs rising. But the road was long, filled with hunger, thirst, disease. Thousands died before ever seeing Jerusalem. The Crusaders' Maronite named Geoffrey joined the first crusade. He walked through lands scorched by sun, across mountains where men froze at night and baked by day. He saw comrades collapse from hunger, gnawing leather straps for food. In towns, he saw markets filled with strange fruits and spices, heard languages he could not name. When they reached Jerusalem, the siege was brutal. Ladders splintered under stones, arrows pierced mail, and fire poured from the walls. At last the city fell, and Geoffrey entered through the gates. He expected heavenly triumph. Instead, he found slaughter. Streets ran red. Women and children lay among the dead. The stench of blood and smoke was unbearable. Geoffrey knelt in the church of the Holy Sepulchre. But his heart was heavy. Was this truly God's will? The monks preaching from battle, monks preached the crusade. Brother Peter, barefoot, walked from village to village, crying that Christ himself had commanded it. His eyes shone with fire. His words moved crowds. Peasants sold homes. Knights pledged swords, children followed, believing they marched to paradise. Few returned. The legacy of World War shaped the age. It carved graves in every village, burned towns, filled chronicles with names of kings and battles. Yet it also shifted the world. Survivors returned with new ideas, new goods, silk, sugar, tales of distant lands. Castles rose stronger, armies grew larger, and the memory of crusading fire burned in Europe for centuries. For peasants, war was loss. For knights, it was trial. For the church, it was proof of power. For all, it was a shadow that never left. Bread was life in the Middle Ages. It was more than food. It was survival, identity, and the measure of a year's fortune. A good harvest meant full bellies, laughter in cottages, and coins in the market. A failed harvest meant hunger that crept like a shadow, hollowing cheeks, thinning bodies, and filling graveyards. For peasants, bread was coarse and dark, made of rye, barley, or oats. They tarred enough to last days. Sometimes it was mixed with ground beans or chestnuts, or even weeds when grain ran short. In desperate years, straw and acorns found their way into dough, bitter and barely edible, but enough to silence a child's cries for a while. The rich ate differently. In a lord's hall, bread was white, baked from fine wheat flour that few peasants ever saw. It was soft, airy, eaten with butter, honey, roasted meat, and wine. But even nobles knew famine, for no rank could conjure grain when fields lay barren. Vegetables filled peasant pots, cabbages, onions, leeks, beans, peas. Meat was rare, save for feast days. Eggs, milk, and cheese came when livestock thrived, but often animals were slaughtered early to save fodder. Hunger shaped every decision: when to sow, when to slaughter, when to beg, when to steal. The hunger yearns. A peasant woman knew hunger well. Her village lay in a shallow valley, its fields thin and stony. That year the rains had come too late, and the barley withered before ripening. By autumn, granaries stood half empty. By winter, they were nearly bare. Each morning, Agnes cut the loaf thinner. She ate the smallest peas herself, saving the rest for her 3 children. She boiled nettles and roots, scraping frost from cabbages in the garden. When even that failed, she ground acorns into flour, though it made their stomachs cramp. Her husband, John, grew silent. He still went to the fields, though nothing grew. He trapped rabbits when he could, but snares often came back empty. His hands, once strong, now trembled from weakness. The children's eyes grew large in their thin faces. At night, they whimpered with hunger. Agnes told them stories to distract them, tales of saints feeding the poor, of loaves that multiplied in a widow's hands, of angels who carried bread in baskets of light. But no miracle came. The Choisio night, as snow drifted against the door, John spoke. We cannot last. Agnes, the children, they fade. I will go to the manor. Perhaps the Lord will give alms. Agnes knew the risk. Lords gave sometimes, but more often they turned beggars away or punished them for trespass. Still, she nodded. Go, beg if you must. Bring something back. He left at dawn. Agnes watched him vanish into the white fields, his figure small against the sky. The children huddled close, their breaths like smoke in the cold. Hours passed. Darkness fell. He did not return, not the stranger, in the third day, as Agnes gathered snow to melt for water. A figure came down the road, not John, but a stranger, a woman, tall, wrapped in furs, her face shadowed by a hood. She carried no pack, no beast, only a staff of dark wood. Agnes froze. Few traveled in such weather. The stranger stopped at the cottage door, lifted her hand, and spoke in a voice deep and steady. You suffer. I have bread. From beneath her cloak she drew a small loaf, white as snow, unlike any bread Agnes had ever seen. The smell was warm, sweet, rich. The children gasped, their eyes wide. But Agnes hesitated. Bread did not come from nowhere. What price? She asked. The woman's eyes, dark as coals, held hers. Only this, that you remember me. She placed the loaf on the table and left. Vanishing into the storm. The miracle and the Memorians cut the bread into 4 pieces. She gave the largest to the children, the smallest to herself. It was soft, filling, unlike any bread she had known. For the first time in weeks, her children slept without whimpering. But when she woke at dawn, the loaf was whole again. Agnes fell to her knees, whispering prayers. Was it God's mercy, or the gift of something else? She did not know. She only knew that her children lived, and each winter after, when hunger came, Agnes told them of the woman with the dark eyes, who asked nothing but memory. If bread kept people alive, clothing and shelter kept them from freezing. In the Middle Ages, warmth was a luxury. Winters were long, cruel, and unforgiving, and every layer of cloth meant the difference between life and death. The fabric of survival peasants were wool, coarse, heavy, often undyed. Its itch never left the skin. Garments were patched again and again, until a tunic was more stitches than cloth. Dyes were costly, so most villagers looked gray or brown, blending with the earth they tilled. Only on feast days might they wear something brighter, passed down for generations. Shoes were a rarity. Many went barefoot in summer and wrapped their feet in rags in winter. Those lucky enough had wooden clogs, which clattered on stone but gave little comfort. Nobles dressed in splendor. Their cloaks were lined with fur, fox, squirrel, ermine. Their tunics shone with colors: scarlet, indigo, deep green, forbidden to common folk by law. Silk from the east glimmered in candlelight, a treasure carried across continents. A lord could be known by the richness of his sleeve before ever he spoke. But warmth, even for nobles, was never certain. Castles were vast and drafty, their stone walls sweating with damp. Rushes covered the floors, but they trapped fleas and filth. Fires blazed in great hearths, yet still guests shivered under layers of cloth. The shelter of the poorer peasants, cottages were small, built of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that leaked in rain. Smoke from the hearth filled the single room, blackening the rafters until soot fell like snow. Families slept together on straw pallets, bodies pressed close for warmth. Animals often shared the space, pigs and goats giving both heat and smell. There was little privacy. Children grew, married, and still lived beneath the same roof. The scent of sweat, manure, and smoke clung to everything. In summer, insects swarmed. In winter, frost rimed the inside of the walls. And yet, these cottages were homes, places of laughter, quarrels, songs, and prayers. A single candle meant comfort. A cloak well mended meant security. Survival was not comfort, but Endurant's story. The weaver's winter. Henry the Weaver lived at the edge of the village, in a cottage smaller than most. His loom stood in the corner, its frame taking more space. then the bed he shared with his wife, Margaret, and their 2 children. By summer, he wove simple cloth for neighbors, gray tunics, brown cloaks, the rough garb of peasants. By autumn, he saved scraps to clothe his own. But that winter came early and hard. Frost killed what little remained in the fields, and snow buried the road. Henry's loom stood silent. No one could pay for cloth when bellies were empty. The family's clothes were patched until patches had patches. Henry wrapped his son's feet in old linen strips, tying them with twine. His daughter wore her mother's old cloak, though it dragged in the mud. Margaret gave her husband her own shawl, saying she needed it less. He saw her shoulders shake in the cold, but she never complained. At night, they huddled together, children between them. The hearth burned only when Henry found wood. Often, he stripped branches from hedges in secret, risking the Lord's punishment. One night, the cold grew sharper than ever. Frost glittered on the walls. Henry's little son whimpered, "Father, I am so cold." Henry rose, took the cloak from his own back, and wrapped it around the boy. Then, desperate, he went to his loom. From the scraps left in his basket, he began to weave. His fingers were numb, the thread uneven. But he worked until dawn. By morning, a small, rough blanket lay on the floor. He draped it over his children. They smiled faintly in their sleep. Margaret touched his arm. "You've given them warmth," she whispered. Henry only nodded. Though tears froze on his cheeks, he knew the blanket would not last the winter. But for one night, his children had dreamed in warmth, and that was enough. In the Middle Ages, family was not only a bond of affection, but a matter of survival, property, and duty. Love, as we understand it today, was rarely the foundation of marriage. Marriage was a contract between families, between lands, sometimes between entire kingdoms. Marriage is a bargain for peasants, a marriage joined to households, strengthening the work of the fields. A bride might bring a dowry of chickens, a cow, or a small strip of land. The groom brought his labor, his hands, and his strength. Consent was often secondary. What mattered was survival. For nobles, marriages were alliances. Daughters were promised as early as infancy, betrothed not to men, but to territories. A girl of 12 might find herself wed to a man of 30 or 40, never having spoken to him before the wedding. The church blessed such unions, declaring that obedience and duty were holy virtues. Yet in stolen corners, true love flickered. A glance across a marketplace, a ribbon tied around a knight's arm, a song hummed by a shepherd to a milkmaid. These sparks rarely altered fate, but they warmed hearts in a cold age. Children in a harsh world, children filled cottages and castles alike, but their lives were fragile. Many died before their 5th year, taken by fever, infection, or hunger. Mothers wept quietly, burying little bodies wrapped in linen, yet still bore more children, knowing loss was inevitable. Those who survived grew quickly into laborers. By 7, boys worked in fields, girls tended animals or spun wool. By 12, they were considered nearly grown. Childhood as we imagine it, a time of play and learning, was brief, almost non-existent. Still, laughter-filled villages. Children chased hoops, carved dolls from wood, splashed in streams. Their games echoed against church walls and castle gates. Even in hardship, joy insisted on living. Story: Edith's marriage. Edith was 13 when her father told her she was to be married. She had not yet braided her hair as a woman, nor left behind the games of childhood. Her hand still bore the ink stains of copying prayers in the village chapel. Her groom was Thomas, a widower of 30. He had land, a patch of barley, to oxen, and a timbered house. Her father called it a good match. Edith said nothing, for daughters were not asked. The wedding day came in winter. The ground frozen hard. Edith wore a gown of her mother's, the hem patched, the sleeves too long. At the altar, Thomas took her hand. His grip was firm, not cruel, but strange. He smelled of earth and smoke. The feast after was thin bread, cabbage, a little ale. Edith sat silent as neighbors laughed. That night, she lay in a bed not her own, her body trembling. Thomas spoke gently, telling her she was safe. Still, she cried into the straw mattress, wishing for her mother's arms not in the months that followed. She learned to manage the household. She fed chickens, churned butter, wove cloth. She bore the silence of duty, yet Thomas was patient. He never raised his hand, never cursed her. When spring came, he showed her how to plant barley, pressing seeds into the soil together. One summer evening, as they worked side by side, he began to hum a tune. Edith looked at him, surprised. His eyes were kind, weary but warm. She felt something stir in her chest. Not love as minstrels sang, but the beginning of it. Years passed. She bore children, buried one, and worked through endless seasons. She grew into womanhood beside Thomas. Their bond forged not in passion, but in endurance, in the quiet gift of shared survival. When she was old, Edith told her daughter, "I did not choose my husband, but I learned to love him, as one learns to love the soil. Hard at first, but rich, if tended with care." Even in an age of hunger and hardship, joy refused to die. The Middle Ages were not only mud and misery, but also color, music, and laughter. Festivals and fairs brought life into villages and towns, binding people together in a rhythm older than memory. The rhythm of the Calendarth, a year of a medieval peasant, was marked not by weeks but by feast days. Nearly 1/3 of the year was holy, a day of rest, prayer, and celebration. Christmas, Easter, Midsummer each came with processions, songs, and games. Between them were saints' days, local feasts, and village fairs. For peasants who worked from dawn until dusk, these days were salvation. On holy days, the plow rested, the loom was silent, and the bell called not to labor, but to prayer. And after prayer came feasting, dancing, and ale. The Fair Village Fair was the great theater of the year. Stalls filled the square with goods from near and far, salted fish, dyed cloth, tin trinkets, spiced wine. The smell of roasted meat and fried pastries hung in the air. Mingling with the sharp tang of manure and sweat, jugglers tossed knives. Acrobats turned cartwheels. Bear baiters drew roaring crowds. Musicians played fiddles and pipes, their rhythms pulling feet into the dust. Dancers formed circles, stamping, clapping, shouting. Children chased each other between stalls, their laughter ringing louder than bells. Games were rough. Football was played not by teams, but by entire villages. A chaos of mud, broken bones, and wild cheers. Wrestling and quarterstaff duels drew wagers. Dice rattled in greedy palms. Fortune tellers whispered secrets for a coin, promising love, wealth, or long life. The taste of celebration food was central. Ale flowed from barrels, cheap and warm. Meat, scarce on ordinary days, appeared in plenty. Pork roasted on spits. Chicken stewed with herbs. Pie stuffed with eels or apples. Honey cakes and sugared almonds were luxuries, treasured by children who licked every crumb. For one day, even the poorest ate until full. Hunger might return tomorrow, but today, they forgot. Story: Robin the Minstrel was a wandering minstrel, thin as his lute's neck, with bright eyes and a voice that carried across squares. He owned little more than his instrument, a patched cloak, and a pouch for coins. But he owned stories, and stories fed him. He went from village to village, fair to fair, singing of kings and knights, of maidens fair and monsters foul. In one town, he earned a loaf, in another only a bed of straw. Sometimes the crowd cheered, sometimes they jeered, but always they listened. One autumn, Robin came to a great fair. The air smelled of roasting pork, the square glittered with stalls, and banners waved in the wind. He took his place near the church wall and began to play. His song told of a poor farmer who outwitted the devil with wit and courage. Children clapped, women laughed, men tossed coins. But as night fell, Robin saw more than joy. A beggar sat by the well, too weak to rise. A mother counted her last pennies, torn between buying bread or cloth. A boy wept after losing all in a dice game. Robin felt the weight of their sorrow. That night, he sang a different song, of hope, of a harvest that never failed, of a king who fed the hungry, of a land where no child cried from hunger. His voice cracked, but the crowd was silent, listening. When he finished, no one cheered. Instead, people bowed their heads. The beggar smiled faintly. The mother bought bread. The boy wiped his tears. Robin had given no food, no gold, but he had given something else, the gift of believing, for a moment, that joy could be real. He left the next morning, cloak thin against the chill, but his song lingered in the square long after he was gone. In the Middle Ages, faith was the heart of life. The church was everywhere, in the bells that called each morning, in the prayers before every meal, in the cross carved above every doorway. God and his saints were not distant but near, shaping every season, every storm, every birth and death. Yet alongside this holy faith lived another, the faith of fear and superstition. Amulets hung above cradles to protect infants from evil spirits. Charms were sewn into clothing to ward off the evil eye. Men carried bits of iron in their pockets to guard against witches. The church thundered against such practices. Yet even priests wore relics of saints as shields against plague. The power of the church promised salvation, but also punishment. Sermons thundered of hellfire, of demons clawing at souls, of purgatory's flames. For peasants, these visions were as real as the frost on their fields. They confessed sins, lit candles, walked barefoot in processions, hoping to win heaven's mercy. Pilgrimages drew thousands. Men and women limped across Europe to touch relics, a saint's bone, a scrap of cloth, a drop of blood said to be holy. They believed such relics could heal blindness, fevers, even death itself. And sometimes, healings happen, whether by miracle, suggestion, or the mysterious power of hope, the shadow of witchcraft up when sickness struck, when crops failed, when children wasted away. Suspicion fell not on God but on neighbors, which, they whispered, pointing to the old woman on the edge of the forest, the healer whose herbs cured as often as they killed. Wise women brewed potions of sage, mint, and poppy, easing fevers and pain. They drew sauce from honey and resin, poultices from garlic and vinegar. Villagers came in secret, crossing themselves, muttering prayers, but they came. For when death knocked, one clutched at any door. The church feared these women. To heal without a holy sanction was to defy God. To mutter charms was to consort with demons. Yet the same villagers who whispered which also begged them for medicine in the night. Story: Martha the healer Marta lived in a crooked hut on the edge of the woods. Her hair was white, her eyes sharp as flint, her hands stained with herbs. She had no husband, no children, only jars of dry leaves, bundles of roots, and a cat that followed her silently. To some, she was a gift. She had drawn fevers from children with willow bark, eased childbirth with mint tea, closed wounds with honey and ash. Mothers blessed her hands. Men left eggs, bread, or coins at her door in thanks, but others feared her. When a cow sickened, they said Martha's shadow had crossed the pasture. When storms ruined fields, they swore she had whispered to the clouds. Children avoided her path, daring each other to touch her gate one winter. Plague swept the village. The priest said it was punishment for sin. He urged prayer and fasting, but people came to Martha. She gave them garlic, vinegar, herbs to burn against the foul air. Some grew well, others died. Then the priest's own nephew fell sick. He raged that Martha was the cause. She has called the devil upon us. He shouted. Fear took root. A crowd gathered, torches in hand. At Martha's door, she stepped outside, her cat at her feet, her hands empty. I have given you nothing but healing, she said. But the crowd cried, Witch, witch. At that moment, a child's voice broke the night. It was Agnes, a little girl Martha had once healed of fever. She clutched her mother's hand, tears shining. She saved me. If she were a witch, I would be dead. The crowd wavered. Some lowered their torches. Others still muttered. At last the priest, shamed by the child's words, ordered Martha spared. But from that day, she lived in greater silence. Fewer came to her door. The village both needed and feared her. She knew her life was balanced on a knife's edge, between saint and witch, between gratitude and hatred. Yet each night, when she lit her lamp, she whispered a prayer, not to demons, but to God. Let me heal, and let them remember me kindly. Life in the Middle Ages was no single story of misery or of joy. It was a tapestry, woven from threads of hunger and laughter, of birth and death, of fear and faith. Each life, whether noble or humble, was a single strand, rough or fine, tangled or smooth, joining the greater cloth of a village, a kingdom, a world. The threads of existence food was a constant thread, thin and fragile. Bread carried people through seasons, sometimes abundant, sometimes bitter with acorns. Warmth was another thread, scarce and precious, found in cloaks, hearts, and the press of family bodies against one another. Love and family were threads both strong and frayed. Some ties were woven by duty, others by chance. Many broke under the strain of famine, war, or plague. Yet others held, enduring through hardship, binding hearts more firmly than law. Festivals added color to the tapestry, bright patches of music and dance amid the gray of toil. Faith and magic embroidered it with symbols, crosses and charms, saints and witches. Death cut threads often, abruptly, without warning. But new threads were always begun, children born, fields planted. Songs sung. The old man's reflection, William, an old peasant, sat by the hearth of his cottage, his hair white, his hands twisted with age. His grandchildren played at his feet, chasing a wooden hoop, their laughter filling the smoky air. He remembered when he, too, had been a child, running barefoot through the fields, eating blackberries in the hedgerows. He remembered his mother's hands, callous from work, breaking bread thinner for herself so he could eat. He remembered hunger, the year the rains failed, when he dug roots from frozen ground and chewed them raw. He remembered the winter when his sister died, her body light as a bundle of sticks. He remembered love, the day he saw Eleanor at the well, her smile shy, her eyes bright. Their wedding was plain, bread, ale, a song sung by a neighbor. But it was joy. They worked the same fields, raised children, buried one. When she died, he dug her grave with his own hands, tears freezing on his beard. He remembered war. The time soldiers came, taking grain, driving off animals, burning barns. He had hidden in the woods with his brothers, clutching sticks, powerless. Later, he had seen bodies on the road, left for crows. He remembered faith. The long walk to the shrine of St. Cuthbert, carrying his sick son in his arms. He remembered kneeling, begging for mercy. The boy had lived, though William never knew if it was miracle or chance, and he remembered joy. The midsummer festival, when the whole village danced in the dust. The first time his son caught a fish. The songs sung at the harvest, when, for once, there was enough bread for all. Now, by the fire. He told these memories to his grandchildren. They listened wide-eyed, their small fingers clutching scraps of wool. Life, he said, is not only sorrow, nor only joy. It is both, woven together, like cloth, strong because it is made of many threads. The children nodded, not fully understanding, but the words sank deep as seeds sink into soil. One day, they would tell their own children. Outside, the wind howled and the thatch trembled. But inside, in the glow of the hearth, the tapestry of life held fast, rough, patched, yet enduring. The Middle Ages have long passed. Their kings lie in tombs of marble, their peasants in unmarked graves. Their castles crumbled into stone heaps. Yet the Middle Ages are not gone. They linger like echoes in the walls of cathedrals, like shadows in narrow streets, like whispers in our very language and customs. The stone that remains walk through any old city in Europe, and you tread the stones peasants once carried. Knights once rode over, monks once blessed with holy water. Cathedrals still stretch into the sky, their spires like fingers pointing to heaven. Bells still toll, as they did 600 years ago, calling people to gather. Castles stand as ruins, but even broken, they dominate hillsides. Children climb their walls, not knowing these stones once sheltered fear and ambition. The very roads we drive were first carved by medieval feet and hooves. The blood that survives for food, too, carries echoes. The bread we eat descends from their loaves, though softer, whiter, sweeter. Our feasts still follow their calendar. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals. The meals we take for granted, meat, fruit, sugar, were luxuries then. Treasures won by war and trade dot our families still echo theirs. Marriage is freer, yet the old idea of alliance, of survival through union, still lingers. Children live longer, but parents still watch over them with the same fierce love, the same fear of loss. Even our entertainments are their children. Our games, our fairs, our theaters grew from their rougher joys. The jugglers, the wrestlers, the minstrels. Music has changed, but still it sings of love and grief as there's dead. The fear that persists in our fears are not so different. We no longer whisper of witches in the woods, but we speak of viruses, of invisible threats, of enemies beyond our walls. We no longer kneel before relics of saints, but we carry lucky charms, wear crosses, trust in things unseen. The line between faith and superstition has not vanished. It has only shifted. The memory of the deadened fields across Europe, farmers still unearth bones when they plowed it deep. They find rusted knives, broken pottery, coins black with time. Each is a reminder. They lived here. They struggled here. They loved, feared, and dreamed just as we do dot in libraries. Monks' handwriting still curls across parchment. Prayers written by candlelight, preserved for centuries. To read their words is to hear their voices. Faint but insistent, we were here. Do not forget us. Many stories of Servavala traveler stands before ruined abbey, the roof gone, the walls split by ivy. He feels silence pressing, but in that silence, he hears chants that once shook these stones. He imagines monks walking, heads bowed, and for a moment, the past is alive. A child in a modern village digs in a field and finds a silver penny, bent, worn smooth. He runs to his mother, laughing. But that coin once paid for bread, once passed from hand to trembling hand in a time of famine. The child does not know, yet he holds history in his palm dot in a museum. A visitor stares at a skeleton. Its teeth are worn, its bones bent by toil. Beside it lies a rosary, beads still intact. She realizes this was not just a peasant, but a man who prayed, who worked, who lived with hope. Tears prick her eyes, and she whispers, "I see you." The eternal tapestry Middle Ages live on in us, not in kings or knights alone, but in every loaf of bread, every song, every festival, every whispered prayer. Their fears became our stories. Their hopes became our customs. Their blood flows in ours. They endured hunger, cold, war, plague. Yet they also danced, laughed, sang, believed. And because they endured, we live. The tapestry is not broken. It stretches from their time to ours, thread upon thread, unbroken, rough but strong. We are part of it, whether we see it or not. When we kneel in a church, when we gather at a festival, when we tell our children stories by firelight, we are not far from them. The Middle Ages have not ended. They live in every stone, every word, every heartbeat. They are us, and we are them. Work is the language the medieval world spoke. Fields and forges, looms and hammers, these were the verbs and nouns of life. Where law and liturgy set the shape of society, labor set its heartbeat, constant, physical, sometimes brutal, often creative. To watch the Middle Ages closely is to stand where the world is made, in the clay of the plowed furrow, in the glow of the smith's forge, in the rhythm of a woman's spindle, the daily round from the moment the light bled over the horizon. Hands were busy. Work answered to the sun and the season. In spring the earth was turned, furrow by furrow, while oxen strained and plowmen groaned with the weight of expectation. Seed had to be hidden in the soil before the rain shifted. Summer meant repair, mending fences, rethatching roofs, shading the ripening grain. Autumn was the harvest, a frenzy of sickles and women's songs, carts creaking under the weight of sheaves. Winter brought mending, weaving, the quiet labor that would keep a household through the thaw. Not all toil was equal. There was a hierarchy of hands. The peasant's back bent for the Lord's field in fealty and in tax. The craftsman toiled to shape things that could be sold or bartered. The mason's stone found its place in a tower that would last centuries. The blacksmith took raw earth iron and turned it into tools that kept the world moving. Guilds organized some of this labor in towns, binding training, quality, and rights into an order that even the Lord could not easily overturn. In the countryside, custom and the open eye of the village kept people to their tasks. Each craft had its own secret language of tools. The weaver spoke in shuttle and loom, counting picks and threads with fingers that remember patterns the eye forgot. The mason read in grain and mortar, testing with line and plumb. The carpenter measured in rule and story, knowing joints that would hold a roof through snow and wind. The smith, the heart of this chapter, spoke with iron, fire, and rhythm. The smith's domain, a smith's shop, is a small volcano of human industry. The forge's mouth breathes wind. The bellows pump a steady, hungry breath. The anvil is an altar where metal is sacralized. Sparks fly like brief constellations when steel meets hammer. The smell is a pungent mixture of sweat, coal, hot iron, and oil. Work at the anvil is both brute force and elegant touch. A strike in the right place opens a curve. Too much, and the metal splits. Too little, and the form fails. Time and heat change metal. Heat to make it soft, plunging to harden. Careful tempering to give it the balance of resilience without brittleness. Blacksmiths were everywhere. In villages making nails and hinges and hose. In towns crafting pots and locks. At castle gates forging spearheads and munition. Their skills were often kept in families, poured into apprenticeships lasting years. A boy taken as an apprentice learned to hammer, to read iron's color, to know the language of scale and grain, and to keep a forge's gossip. Whose horse needed race-shoeing, which plowshare was cracked, or where the steward might demand a service at dawn. The economy of sweat labor was also bargaining. A smith's work could free a family from ruin or condemn a man to cold fields. Wages were seldom in coin alone. Barter, a sack of grain, a hen, a week of labor, made up the ledger. The Lord's agents might come with written commands, requisition this or that for the war, supply arms for the company, stand ready to repair a cart at midnight. A smith's moral calculations were rarely theoretical. The blade he made could help a neighbor defend his barn, or it could be swung against the village itself by soldiers in the service of another lord. Work was dangerous. A slip of the hammer, a coal rolled in an unlucky place, a breath of noxious fumes from bad or could maim or kill. Men and women shaped themselves into their crafts, fingers thickened, shoulders hunched, lungs salted with smoke. Illnesses wore the body down, and the old retired to sit on doorstones and watch the young form the world anew. Story: Thomas the Smith Thomas was the sort of man whose presence was first felt in the forge's heartbeat, before his voice or face were recognized. He lived on a lane that smelled constantly of metal and mud, in a house whose back wall had a window looking into the forge. From boyhood, he had known hammer and bellows. His father had ferried him a wooden mallet and told him to keep pace with the rhythm of struck iron. By 20, he had hands like worked leather, a face lined with coals and worry, and a reputation for making strong plowshares and honest horseshoes. Thomas married early. His wife, Ellen, kept the household and mended where he could not. Their son, little Jory, ran barefoot between the anvil and the kiln, learning danger by imitation. The smith's day followed a ritual. Before dawn, Thomas would stoke the coals. By sunup the bellows sang. By mid-morning the ring of metal met wood, and sound rose in measured swells across the lane. He made what the village needed, nails to keep the roof from the winter wind. A door hinge with a decorative curl when a neighbor's pride demanded it. The heavy iron yoke when oxen broke their old one. And when the steward demanded it, blades for men who called themselves soldiers. Unlike the romanticized image of the swordsmith crafting shining blades for noble heroes, Thomas's work was a ledger. He balanced orders, payments, and favors. If he forged a spearhead for a traveling lord, the village's dues for the year might be lighter. If he refused, the lord's reeve might enact a fine or take his grain. One year the winter was savage and the lord's men came more often than before. The steward's face had grown thin with the season's pressure. He arrived one night with a command. The castle was to be outfitted for a mustering. Arms and harness, the steward said, and I bring coin. Coin was light when measured against the need to feed a family. But Thomas saw the irony. The Lord would take grain from barns to feed his retinue, and give little back. He knew, too, what arms meant when men marched hungry. Thomas's dilemma settled around him like frost. He could fill the steward's order and be rewarded with enough grain to survive the winter. Or he could refuse and risk the Lord's displeasure. He resolved to do both ways a trick. He agreed to make the arms the steward, demanded but tempered them in a manner that made them sound and true for defensive fighters, good for fences and for work, and yet ill-suited for the heavy cleaving of an offensive company. It was a small, cunning art, tempering by degrees, introducing a slight flexibility that would fail under prolonged brutal shock, but serve well in honest village needs. The steward left satisfied and distributed the weapons. Months later, when the Lord's men rode off to a neighboring dispute, some of the confiscated blades proved brittle in the worst places. Hearing of the failure, the steward sought Thomas in fury, but he could not prove malice, only technical nuance. Thomas suffered a small fine and a cold night in the stocks, but the family kept their stores. A different crisis came when a traveler's cart broke near Thomas's forge. In the cart was a young woman carrying her ailing father. She begged for the wheel's repair and not for the spearheads of men. Thomas, who had a stubborn tenderness for small tragedies, took the wheel from the merchant's hand and worked through the night. He repaired the axle, fashioned new iron hoops, and refused any coin, taking only bread and a promise of prayer. The daughter never forgot him. Decades later, she called him the man who fixed my world. Work was never pure for Thomas. Once a barn burned and the Lord came asking for iron to mend gates. The Lord's men had been the ones looting neighbors during the raid. Thomas made iron nonetheless, because hunger has a weight heavier than judgment. But he also kept a hidden cache of nails and a spare set of horseshoes in a pit behind his shed, which he shared at midnight with families whose oxen had been taken. It was a small rebellion of the necessary kind. The forge gave Thomas his pride and his pain. An accident left him scarred across one arm. One summer, a seam of bad coal flared in the hearth. A spark leapt and caught the cuff of his sleeve. He tore at the flame to smother it, and his hand seared. The scar pitted his arm like the hammered surface of the iron he loved. For months he could hardly lift the hammer. Pain taught him patience. He learned to direct apprentices rather than be the sole muscle at the anvil. Jory, his son, grew under his patient instruction, learning not just craft, but the moral choices the trade required. As the years gathered, Thomas became a repository of the village's small histories. The horseshoeing that saved a mare, and her foal, the door lock that kept a widow's heirloom safe, the iron brace that held a chapel beam through wind and rain. Young men came to him with promises to leave the manor and go to towns. He gave them advice about tool and trade and the stubborn ethics of work. He taught that to make a thing well was itself a kind of prayer. Honest hands, careful temper, respect for the material. When Thomas grew old, the forge grew quieter. He still sat by the hearth of the shop, hands more knot than hand, and watched apprentices take blows, listened to the iron's color, bend and shape like reeds in water. The day he could no longer lift the hammer, he set the tool, his father's mallet, into a box and passed it to Jory with a smile. "Keep it straight, lad. Heed it true. Don't let hunger hollow your hands of mercy." Thomas's story is not unique, a life threaded through with decisions, where the fine line between survival and conscience runs close. The smith's work does more than fashion metal. It builds the scaffolding of daily life. Nails, hinges, plowshares, keys. These are the small devices that hold together households and towers alike. In the smith's sweat, a village finds its continuity. The war beyond the chronicler kings and lords fought their wars for reasons that common folk seldom understood. A quarrel over succession, a claim to a title, a border disputed in court. These became banners beneath which thousands marched. Chroniclers recorded the victories, listed the noble dead, traced the banners of heraldry. But in villages, war was not written in books. It was written in fire on thatched roofs, in blood spilled on the mud of fields, in hunger-gnawing bellies when barns were emptied. For the peasants, war was a storm that broke without warning. One day the fields sang with birdsong. The next, horsemen appeared on the horizon, and life became flight, fear, and fire. Soldiers did not live on promises or parchment decrees. They lived on bread, ale, and meat, and they took them where they could. The cost of protection, every lord claimed to offer protection to his tenants. Yet protection came with a price. Taxes rose in wartime. Grain, cattle, and tools were seized to feed armies. A plow might vanish into the hands of men at arms. A farmer's best ox might be led away by a sergeant with no coin offered in return. Resistance meant the lash, or worse, even when the war was fought elsewhere, its shadow fell on villages. Rumors ran faster than riders. This town burned, that abbey pillaged, that road unsafe. Mothers shivered when their sons were called to muster for the levy, knowing that few peasants who marched with spears ever returned whole. The soldiers shadowed it. All soldiers were mercenaries. Some were neighbors, pressed into service. A boy who had plowed a furrow beside you in spring might be clad in mail by autumn. But the transformation was brutal. Hunger, fear, and discipline twisted men into predators. Mercenary companies were worse still. Bands of hardened men who owed allegiance to coin alone. They roamed like wolves, stripping fields bare, burning villages that could not pay ransom. Even their names, the free companies, the rowdiers, struck terror. Behind them lay blackened earth. Memory and ash war left scars deeper than wounds. A burnt barn could be rebuilt, a dead ox replaced in time. But the memory of smoke, of screams in the night, of a father dragged from his doorway, these did not fade. Stories passed through generations. The year the soldiers came, the day the abbey fell, the night the men rode in black armor. Children grew up with these tales, their lullabies mixed with warnings. Be good, or the soldiers will come, mothers said, and always the memory was sharpened. Soldiers did not come as knights in shining armor, but as men who stole bread from children's mouths. Story: John the orphan. John was 7 years old when war came to his village. He remembered the day as a tangle of sights and sounds that never left him. The thunder of hooves, the sudden screams, the smell of smoke thick in his lungs. He had been playing near the well when the riders appeared, lances glinting in the pale sun. At first, he thought it was a parade, but then his father shouted, "Inside, John," and the riders spread like fire. Doors were kicked open, chickens scattered. The reeve was cut down when he tried to plead. John's mother grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the woods. But in the rush she stumbled. A soldier caught her by the hair, and John saw her dragged into the yard. He ran, heart pounding, ears ringing. He hid in a hollow tree while smoke billowed into the sky. He heard the shouts, the laughter, the cries. When the noise faded, he crept back. His house was ashes. His father's body lay near the well, cut open. His mother was gone. For days he wandered the wreckage of his world. Neighbors were dead or fled. The fields were trampled, the barns looted. A few survivors gathered in the ruined church, too dazed to speak, John curled in a corner, clutching a charred wooden toy he had pulled from the ashes. A monk found him weeks later, part of a band of refugees walking toward a monastery. John walked with them, silent, carrying nothing but the toy. At the monastery, he was given bread, a cot, and eventually a place as a novice. His hands learned to copy letters instead of sow seeds. His eyes learned to follow parchment lines instead of furrows. But memory never left him. When he bent over a manuscript, the ink seemed to turn into smoke. When bells tolled, he remembered screams. When he read of noble battles and chronicles, he tasted ashes. Years later, as an old man, Brother John wrote his own chronicle, not of kings and victories, but of that one day when war came to a village. He wrote, "They tell of banners and victories, of knights and their glories. I tell of a well and a mother's cry, of barns that burn, of bread stolen from the mouths of children. For that, too, is war. Do not forget it." His manuscript lay in a monastery chest for centuries, until a scholar found it. And in those words, the voice of a boy who once hid in a tree still speaks. A fragile beginning to be a child in the Middle Ages was to begin life on the edge of death. Many never survived their first year. Disease, hunger, and poor sanitation carried away infants with merciless regularity. A mother might baptize her baby within hours of birth, fearing it would die unshriven if she waited. Small graves dotted every churchyard. Their wooden crosses weathered before the names could even be remembered. But for those who lived past infancy, childhood was both short and long. Short, because work began almost as soon as one could walk. Long, because the road to adulthood was uncertain, full of waiting, training, and risk. Childhood was not a golden age of freedom, but a preparation for survival. The child at Workby, the age of 5 or 6, peasant children were expected to help. They scared crows from fields, fetched water, gathered firewood. Girls spun flax, boys carried dung to the fields. Older children minded younger ones, cradling babies on their hips as they hauled buckets. Childhood was a community of labor, each small hand doing its part to keep hunger away dotting towns. Children of artisans joined their parents at the workshop. A baker's son carried flour sacks. A tailor's daughter sorted scraps. By 7 or 8, many were apprenticed, bound by oath to a master for 7 or more years. Their labor traded for training and board. Apprenticeships could be harsh, even cruel, but they promised skills and the chance of independence. Among the nobility, children's work was different, but no less demanding. Boys were sent to other households as pages, learning courtesy, arms, and horsemanship. Girls were trained in managing estates, weaving, and the delicate diplomacy of noble marriage. Childhood was not a shield from responsibility. It was the forge that shaped it. The child at play survived. Children carved whistles from reeds, rolled hoops, and played with dolls of wood or cloth. They sang rhymes, threw dice, raced barefoot, and imitated the games of their elders. Boys staged mock battles with sticks. Girls practiced feats with clay cups. Even in the poorest cottages, laughter echoed. A wooden toy, a puppy, a skipping rhyme could turn mud into joy. Festivals brought chants for merriment. Children danced in circles, chased ribbons, or watched jugglers with wide eyes. Play was fragile, fleeting, but it was life's refusal to be crushed by toil. The child in danger, but childhood was always shadowed by danger. Fevers took many. Measles, smallpox, dysentery struck without warning. Malnutrition left children stunted, their ribs sharp as knives. Accidents were common, drownings in wells, burns by fire, falls from trees. Death was not an intruder in childhood. It was a constant guest. Parents loved their children fiercely, but they learned to love with a guarded heart. Too many small coffins had been lowered into the earth. A mother wept when her child died, but she also whispered a prayer of thanks that the little one had been baptized, safe in heaven. In their theology, children were angels lent for a season, not always for a lifetime. The child in learning, most children never saw a school. Learning was by ear, by hand, by imitation. A boy learned to sew by following his father. A girl learned to spin by watching her mother. But in towns, schools did exist, run by monasteries, by guilds, by parish priests. There, children learned their letters, some Latin, perhaps a scrap of arithmetic. Books were rare, precious beyond measure. A child who could read was marked for another life, as a scribe, a priest, a clerk. For a peasant child, such dreams were as distant as the stars. The story, Alice. The peasant's daughter Alice was born in a small cottage at the edge of a village. Her mother attended by a midwife with herbs and whispered prayers. She was the third child. Two siblings had died before her, one in fever, one in the cradle. Her mother prayed over her fiercely, sprinkling holy water, clutching a charm against the evil eye. Alice survived. By 5, she carried water in clay jugs from the well. By 7, she minded her younger brother while her parents worked the fields. By 10, she could spin flax, bake coarse bread, and tend a small patch of cabbages. Her hands were never still. Childhood was work. But Alice's eyes sparkled with something more, for Alice had discovered letters. One day, she followed her mother to church. The priest, old and bent, unrolled a book of psalms. The letters danced like tiny drawings across the page. Alice was transfixed. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "What are they?" Her mother hushed her, but Alice asked again, later, until her mother sighed. "They are the words of God, written down. Only priests can read them." But Alice would not forget. She traced letters in the dirt with a stick, copying shapes she had glimpsed. She pestered the village clerk, offering eggs to see his papers. She whispered rhymes to herself, trying to remember. The priest noticed her one day, watching intently during Mass. Afterward, he asked her name. She stammered it. He smiled faintly. A child hungry for words is rarer than one hungry for bread. But both hungers are dangerous. He taught her, secretly at first, a letter here, a sound there. She scratched them into wood, muttered them as she worked. Her parents feared. Books are for priests, not for girls, her father warned. But Alice persisted. One winter, when sickness swept the village, Alice read prayers aloud from a borrowed psalter. The villagers wept, hearing their own child's voice speak the sacred words. She has a gift, they said, or perhaps a curse. When Alice was 15, she was offered a place in a convent, where her skill could grow. She left her cottage with tears and trembling, clutching a psalter bound in leather. Her mother wept, but blessed her. Better a nun than a corpse in the field. Alice's life in the convent was not easy. Discipline was harsh, food scarce. But she learned Latin, copied texts, and filled margins with small flowers and birds. She grew old in the scriptorium, her hands ink-stained, her eyes weary. Yet in her heart she remained the barefoot girl who had traced letters in the dust. She believed that to read was a miracle, no less than to breathe. Her manuscripts, preserved in the convent library, carried her name, Sister Alice, who loved the word. Centuries later, a scholar leafing through those pages paused at her signature. And in that moment, the voice of a peasant's daughter, who once begged to know the shapes in a psalter, spoke again. The shape of darkness night in the Middle Ages was not the soft glow of lamplight we know. It was a force, deep, heavy, absolute. Without street lamps, without electricity, darkness was total. Once the sun sank, the world shrank to the circle of firelight in a cottage or the narrow flicker of a torch. Beyond that, there was only shadow. The night was not merely absence of light. It was presence of threat. Wolves prowled the edges of fields, their howls rolling through valleys like drums. Thieves crept along roads, blades hidden under cloaks. Spirits were said to stir when the church bell tolled midnight. Every shadow was a whisper, every gust of wind a warning. The village at night when dusk fell. The village folded itself inward. Doors were barred with heavy wood. Shutters clapped closed. Fires were banked low to save fuel, but enough left glowing to keep the darkness at bay. Families huddled close, bodies pressed together on straw pallets. Children were warned not to wander. The night takes those who walk alone, Mothers said only a few stirred after sundown. Bakers rose at midnight to prepare dough for the morning. Millers sometimes turned their wheels by moonlight. And the night watch, chosen men, armed with staves and horns, paced the lanes. Their duty was to shout the hours, to cry out warnings, all's well, or fire. Their voices carried like fragile threads across the silence, the city at night in towns. The gates closed with a thud at dusk. Curfew bells rang. Torches guttered along walls. Night meant danger. Inns barred their doors. Taverns lowered shutters. Strangers were watched with suspicion. The watchmen carried lanterns, halberds, and keys. They arrested drunkards, thieves, and sometimes even honest folk caught outside without permit. But night also carried secret life. Lovers slipped through alleys to meet by candlelight. Smugglers moved goods under starlight. Beggars huddled in church porches. The city after dark was a place of risk and temptation, where whispers grew louder than sermons. Fear and faith colored the night. The boundary between the living and the dead was believed thinnest in darkness. Stories told of ghosts wandering graveyards, of witches flying to secret gatherings, of demons perched on rafters. Mothers hung charms above cradles. Fathers carved crosses into doors. Priests blessed the lanes on All Hallows Eve, sprinkling holy water to guard against what might walk. Nightmares were more than dreams. They were warnings, visitations. A child who woke screaming was thought to have been pressed upon by a hag or tempted by a devil. Families prayed aloud in the dark, their voices trembling but defiant. Story: Godfrey. The watchman Godfrey was an old man, though his back still held a soldier's strength. He had once marched with a lord's levy, carrying a spear on muddy roads. But when his hair turned gray, he returned to the village of his birth. There he took the post of night watchman, a role half respected, half pitied. He carried a staff, a lantern, and a horn, and his duty was to guard the sleeping. His nights were long. He paced the lanes, his lantern swinging, the straw roofs above him whispering in the wind. Dogs barked as he passed. Shutters opened a crack, then closed. All's well, he called, though sometimes his voice cracked. Few thanked him. Most muttered that he was half mad to walk where spirits roamed. One winter's night, when snow crusted the thatch and the moon was pale as bone, Godfrey heard a sound. It was not the howl of wolves, nor the creak of trees. It was a cry, faint, stretched, like a woman's voice. He followed it past the churchyard, where the stones leaned like weary men. There, by the old yew tree, he saw a figure, white, thin, swaying. Long hair floated in the wind. Godfrey's blood chilled. A ghost, he thought. One of the restless, his hand went to the cross around his neck. He raised his staff. In the name of Christ, be gone. He shouted. The figure turned. Pale face, hollow eyes. But then, a cough. A ragged, human cough. Godfrey stepped closer. It was no ghost, but a woman. She was barefoot, her dress torn, her skin blue with cold. She had fled her home, beaten by a cruel husband, and sought refuge by the church. Too weak to call louder, she had been mistaken for a spirit. Godfrey wrapped his cloak around her and carried her to the rectory. The priest gave her bread and warmth. She lived, though scarred. The village whispered of her for years, some saying she was cursed, others that she was blessed. For Godfrey, the night changed the day. He had learned that shadows were not always devils, that sometimes fear hides the broken and the desperate. Still, he walked his rounds, staff and lantern in hand. But when he called all's well, he meant it not as a ritual cry, but as a prayer. Memory of darkness for medieval people, night was not just the end of day. It was the border of the known world. It reminded them of death, of judgment, of the unknown. Yet they faced it each evening, armed with prayer, fire, and fragile courage. And those centuries have passed. Some of their fears linger in us. We still whisper of things in the dark. We still fear footsteps on an empty road. The Middle Ages have left us not only cathedrals and chronicles, but the shiver we feel when the night grows to quiet. the heart of exchange in a medieval world where villages were bound by fields and seasons. The marketplace was a sudden burst of color, sound, and possibility. Once or twice a week in towns, and on feast days in larger villages, stalls sprang up like a forest of canvas. Merchants spread out bowls of cloth dyed with madder red or woad blue. Fishmongers laid out salted herring and eels. Butchers hung rabbits and chickens by their feet. Spices, rare and costly, perfumed the air. Pepper, saffron, cinnamon, each worth more than gold to peasants who knew only salt. The marketplace was not merely commerce. It was theater. Musicians strummed lutes, jugglers tossed knives, beggars wailed for alms. Gossip spread faster than coins. Which lord had died? Which battle had been won? Which bishop quarreled with the king? For a villager who had never walked beyond the next field, the market was the world condensed into a square. The road between worlds still reached the market. People took to the road, and the road was both bridge and peril. Pilgrims in rough woolen cloaks trudged side by side with merchants leading carts of goods. Monks on errands carried letters sealed with wax. Nobles on horses galloped past, splashing mud on all who walked. The road united kingdoms, but it also carried danger. Bandits lurked in forests, demanding purses under threat of knife. Tollkeepers squeezed travelers for coin at bridges and gates. Weather could turn the path into a swamp of mud or a frozen sheet of ice. To walk the road was to gamble with hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Yet still they walked, for the road meant trade, and trade meant survival. The marketplace is a mere market's mirror society itself. A noblewoman might ride in, her servants carrying baskets, while peasants sold eggs and onions for a few coppers. A priest might haggle over parchment beside a beggar with a wooden bowl. The mingling of classes was uneasy but inevitable. Here, in the noise of bargaining, the divisions of feudal life blurred for a moment. Markets were also places of regulation and control. Weights and measures were inspected. Taxes were collected. Strangers were watched. A thief caught in the act could lose more than his purse. Yet markets were also loopholes in a world of rigid ties. A runaway serf might vanish into the crowd. A soldier might sell his spoils. A young girl might glimpse a life beyond her cottage. Story: Martin the peddler Martin was born the son of a miller, but his restless feet carried him farther than the wheel ever could. As a boy, he watched merchants arrive at the village, their packs bulging with goods from distant towns, knives from the smithies of York, combs of bone from France, beads of glass that caught the light like stars. Martin longed to see where such wonders came from. At 16, he left with nothing but a staff and a pouch of coins. He apprenticed himself to a traveling peddler, learning the art of carrying the world in a pack. Soon he was one himself, trudging from village to village, his bell tinkling to announce his arrival. Children rushed to him first, for he carried ribbons, pens, whistles. Wives came next, fingering needles, mirrors, and combs. Husbands eyed knives, whetstones, and belts. Martin's pack was heavy, but his tales were heavier still. He told of markets in London, where stalls stretched as far as the eye could see. He spoke of Flemish weavers, of ships in Bristol that smelled of spice, of Germans who drank beer stronger than wine. He spun stories of faraway wars and distant kings, though he had only glimpsed them from roadsides. For 30 years Martin walked the roads. He slept in barns, in ditches, under abbey porches. He knew every milestone, every toll gate, every inn where bread was stale but cheap. Bandits robbed him twice. Once he nearly froze in a snowstorm. Yet still he walked, because he belonged nowhere and everywhere died in his old age. When his legs grew stiff and his pack too heavy, Martin settled in a town. Children who had once run to him now brought their own children to hear his stories. He no longer sold wares, but he still sold wonder, the memory of roads and markets, of a world larger than any one field. When he died, the priest remarked, he was no lord, no knight, no scholar, but he carried more of Christendom on his back than any book. The roads legacy of marketplace and the road bound medieval life together. Without them, villages would have starved, isolated by fields and famine. With them, ideas, goods, and stories traveled. A piece of silk in a village chest, a prayer learned from a wandering friar, a song sung by a peddler. All were gifts of the road, and so, while kings carved borders and lords built castles, it was the humble market and the dusty road that kept Christendom alive. For medieval people, death was never far. It was not hidden behind hospital walls or spoken of in whispers. It lived in the cottage with them, in the fever that took a child overnight, in the fall from a horse, in the infected wound that refused to close. Death was not a visitor. It was a neighbor, always at the door. Churchyards stood at the heart of every village, their graves crowding close to the church like children clinging to their mother. Crosses of wood leaned and rotted, names fading into earth. Skulls and bones sometimes surfaced after rains, reminders that the ground could not contain forever the weight of generations. Children played between graves. Men sharpened scythes within sight of them. The living and the dead shared the same soil, and the boundary was thin. Ritual and farewell. When death came, the village gathered. Bells tolled, women keened, men dug. The priest sprinkled holy water, read the psalms, swung the censer. The body was washed, dressed, and borne on a bier through lanes lined with neighbors. Even the poorest man was given dignity in death, for to deny burial was to deny humanity. But not all deaths were equal. The rich could afford candles, masses, and prayers sung by monks to speed their souls. The poor had only the prayers of family, murmured in cold churches. Yet in the graveyard, all lay side by side, lord and serf alike. The earth was the great equalizer. The plague's shadow. No discussion of medieval death can ignore plague. The Black Death of the 14th century swept away villages in days. Carts piled high with corpses rolled to pits outside towns. Priests themselves perished, unable to give last rites. People said the air itself was poisoned. They fled, abandoned kin, shuttered houses. For survivors, the memory was worse than the sickness. Whole families gone, entire streets silent. Churchyards overflowed, new ones hastily consecrated. Survivors walked with haunted eyes, waiting for the next cough to summon doom. Death was no longer a neighbor. It was a storm that devoured all. Memory and the soul. Medieval people did not fear only the body's end. They feared the soul's fate. Hell was preached with fire and worms. Purgatory with flames of cleansing. Heaven with choirs of light. To die without confession was terror. To die unbaptized was despair. Thus priests were summoned at the first sign of fever, and infants baptized at once. Families kept death close in memory. Anniversaries were marked with prayers. Masses were paid for the souls of the departed. The dead were not gone. They were companions, present in dreams, invoked in blessings, feared in curses. Story: Thomas the Gravid of Gurthamas had been a gravid digger for 40 years. His hands were callous from spade and pick, his back bent from lifting earth. He was not a learned man, not a priest, not a knight, but he knew more of life and death than any of them, for he saw where all journeys ended. As a boy he had tended sheep. When famine struck, he watched neighbors die in fields. When plague came, he buried his own parents. The priest, seeing his strength and his silence, gave him the task no one else would take, to dig the graves. At first, Thomas wept at everybody. The girl who had sung and made dances, the farmer who had lent him tools, the child whose laugh still rang in his ears. But as years passed, his tears hardened into ritual. He dug, lowered, covered. He learned to measure grief by the depth of soil. Yet he remembered every face. He could tell you where the miller's wife lay, where the blacksmith's son rested, where the priest who taught him psalms was buried. His memory was a second graveyard, invisible but enduring. One winter, plague returned. The dead came faster than he could dig. The priest fell ill. The church fell silent, and Thomas worked alone. He dug pits where coffins could not be afforded, laid bodies wrapped only in sheets. He prayed aloud, though no one was there to hear. He told the dead their names as if to remind the earth who it had received. When spring came, he was gone, his hands raw, his eyes hollow. Yet he had endured. Villagers whispered he was half ghost himself, living among the dead. But Thomas only said, "The dead are not to be feared. Only the forgetting of them is an old age." He could no longer dig. Children brought him food, sat at his feet, asked for stories. He told them of the girl with flowers in her hair, the boy who dreamed of seeing the sea, the old woman who baked bread for every feast. He remembered them, so that they would not vanish. When Thomas died, he was buried in the very yard he had tended all his life. The villagers raised a stone for him, simple and plain. It read, "Here lies Thomas, who dug our graves, and kept our names." And so, the gravedigger who carried the memory of hundreds became a memory himself, folded into the earth, where all roads meet. Death's legacy in the Middle Ages was not hidden, not silenced. It was present in word, prayer, laughter, and fear. It gave urgency to labor, tenderness to love, solemnity to prayer. It bound generations, reminding each that their time was brief, that life was fragile. That memory was sacred. And those centuries have passed. Their intimacy with death still whispers to us. Every candle lit for the departed, every name carved in stone, every silence held at gravesides. These are echoes of a world that knew death not as an end, but as a companion, voices in the dark in a world without books for most, without theaters, without the hum of machines. Words and music were the threads that bound the imagination. Songs and stories carried wisdom, laughter, warning, and comfort. They were the poor man's library, the child's schoolroom, the widow's consolation. Every village had its singers, every town its storytellers. By the hearth, fathers told tales of saints who tamed wolves or of knights who battled dragons. Mothers crooned lullabies older than memory, their words softening the harshness of hunger. Children chanted rhymes and games, each verse a scrap of heritage passed down. The wandering minstrel spanned the village hearth. Came the wandering voices, minstrels, jongleurs, troubadours. They walked from castle to castle, from fair to fair, carrying music like fire. Their songs spoke of distant battles, of kings crowned and betrayed, of women whose beauty kindled wars. They strummed harps, blew flutes, beat drums, for peasants who had never seen a king. The minstrel's song was a window. For nobles, it was a mirror of glory. But for both, it was magic, words woven with rhythm that turned cold nights into feasts. Minstrels were not always welcomed. Priests muttered that their songs tempted people to sin. Lords sometimes chased them as beggars. Yet they endured, because people hungered for their stories as much as for bread. Stories as survival stories were not only for joy. They were weapons against despair. Legends of saints promised that holiness could overcome plague and famine. Tales of tricksters showed that wit might defeat power. Fables of talking beasts taught children to laugh at fear. In dark winters, stories stretched time. A grandmother's tale could turn a night of hunger into a night of wonder. A rhyme about the stars might make a child forget the cold. Stories preserved memory. They told of floods, of fires, of wars. Through them, the dead still spoke. Story. Even the storyteller was born with a crooked back, and so could not plow or fight. In a world where strength meant survival, many pitied him, others mocked him. But his tongue was sharp, and his memory sharper. He listened to monks chanting psalms, to peasants muttering proverbs, to soldiers swapping tales by the fire. He wove them all into his own. He began to wander. His staff was carved with symbols. His pouch held scraps of parchment. His head was full of voices. He would enter a village square, clear his throat, and begin, "Hear now, hear now," the tale of St. Cuthbert and the Crow. Children gathered first, then women, then even tired men set down their tools. His stories flowed, of kings betrayed by greed, of maidens who outwitted tyrants, of devils chased by holy water. He acted them out, leaping, whispering, roaring. Once, during a famine, a village near death gathered in silence. Eamon arrived, gone as they were. He told them a tale of a widow who, though she had only one crust of bread, shared it with a stranger, and by morning her oven was full. The people laughed, some wept. They had no more bread than before, but they rose lighter, as if fed. Not all welcomed him. A stern priest accused him of spreading lies. Eamon bowed and answered, "Father, I tell not lies but truths dressed in rags. If people smile, if children sleep, is that not also the work of God? He lived long, though never rich. He slept in barns, in cloisters, under stars. But he left behind more than coin could buy. His tales traveled with others, reshaped, red-holed, but alive. When he died, no stone marked his grave, but in cottages and halls, when grandmothers told of saints and fools, echoes of Eamon's voice remain. The songs, legacy songs, and stories were more than entertainment. They were glue from memory, lanterns in darkness, threads binding a fractured world. They gave peasants courage, lords flattery, children laughter. They gave meaning when meaning was thin. In their songs lived the soul of the Middle Ages, not only the steel of knights, or the prayers of monks, but the laughter around fires, the tears at a tale, the hush as a story ended. And though the minstrels are gone, their voices linger, for humanity still lives by story. The wheel of the year medieval life turned not on clocks, but on the circle of seasons. Time was not measured in hours, but in labors, plowing, sowing, harvesting, storing. The year was a wheel, creaking slowly through birth, death, and renewal. To live was to walk the wheel, to obey its rhythm, to endure its burdens and its gifts. Spring brought hope and peril. Summer was toil and sweat. Autumn was reckoning. Winter was survival. In this turning, peasants lived and died, and even kings could not command the weather. Spring, hope and risk. When frost melted and the first shoots pierced the soil, villagers felt both joy and fear. It was the season of plowing. Oxen strained against heavy earth, men behind them shouting, praying that the furrow would be straight, that the seed would take. Hunger was sharpest in spring, for the old harvest was gone and the new not yet grown. Families ate nettles, peas, then gruel. Children's bellies swelled with emptiness. Yet every sprouting seed was a promise. If they endured, bread would return. Spring also carried danger. Floods swelled rivers, drowning fields. Late frosts killed blossoms. Disease came with damp, but still, spring was joy. Lambs bleated. Calves stumbled on shaky legs, and villagers danced on May Day, crowning a girl with flowers as queen of the meadow. Summer, toil, and sweat. Summer was not leisure but labor. Fields thickened with grain, and every hand was needed. Men reaped with sickles, women bound sheaves, children gleaned fallen stalks. Sweat darkened tunics, backs bent from dawn to dusk. Hay had to be cut, dried, stacked. Without it, beasts would starve in winter. Vegetables swelled, orchards ripened, bees filled hives. Days were long, but nights short, for work pressed heavy. Yet summer also held feasts. After St. John's Day, villagers lit bonfires, leapt through flames to ward off sickness, sang songs that mingled prayer with laughter. Summer was abundance, but also exhaustion, a test of muscle, and without autumn, reckoning. Autumn was the most decisive time. Harvest. Sacks of grain were threshed and stored in barns, watched with anxious eyes. The tithe had to be given to the priest, rents paid to the Lord, seed kept for next year. Only then could a family count what was left. For the fortunate, autumn meant plenty, full bins, apples drying, meat salted. For the poor, it meant hunger waiting just beyond, a mistake in storing, a fire in the barn, too much given in rent, and the family would starve. Autumn was also a time of fairs. After the harvest, villagers walked to market towns, selling what they could, buying what they lacked. Songs filled the air, and for a moment, after labor, joy returned. Winter, survival. Winter was the great enemy. Snow-buried fields, winds cut through huts, food dwindled. Families lived on bread crusts, cabbage soup, salted pork if they were lucky. Fires burned low. Wood was precious. Sickness thrived. Coughs, fevers, chills. Old and young died most. Wolves prowled close to villages, hunger making them bold. Children woke to frost on blankets. Mothers prayed their infants would live to spring. And yet winter was also memory and faith. People huddled close, telling stories, singing carols at Christmastide, sharing what little they had. Winter tested bodies, but it also bound souls together. Story: Margaret was a peasant woman with 3 children and a husband, Robert. Her year told the story of thousands died in spring. She rose before dawn, walking barefoot to the fields with Robert. They plowed together, she sowing while he guided the oxen. Hunger gnawed, for their stores were low. She boiled nettles and bark, fed children with thin pottage, prayed the shoots would rise. Summer pressed hard. She cut hay with aching arms, nursed her baby between tasks, carried water in sweating heat. Her eldest son cut his hand with a sickle. She bound it with linen, whispering prayers. Nights brought no rest. Fleas bit, and fears of storm haunted her. Autumn came with relief. Grain filled their sacks, apples hung heavy. Margaret dried herbs, salted beans, smoked meat. But the tithe took more than she wished, and the Lord's steward claimed their best pig. Still, her children laughed as she baked the first bread of the new crop. For 1 week, they ate like kings. Then winter fell. Snow trapped them. Food shrank. Robert grew sick with coughs, and Margaret feared his breath would cease. She sat by the hearth, feeding the fire with scraps of wood, telling her children stories of saints and heroes. Their eyes widened, and hunger was, for an hour, forgotten. Robert survived, thin but alive. Spring returned. Margaret walked again to the fields, her baby now toddling beside her. Her hands blistered but steady. She knew the wheel would turn again. Toil, fear, joy, loss, and she would walk it. Because there was no other road. The eternal wheel of seasons shaped more than crops. They shaped lives, marriages, wars, even prayers. They taught patience, humility, resilience. To live in the Middle Ages was to live by the rhythm of earth, to endure its cruelties, to cherish its gifts. And though today we measure time by clocks and calendars, we still feel the old rhythm in us, the relief of spring, the labor of summer, the reckoning of autumn, the silence of winter. The wheel still turns, as it did for Margaret and for millions like her.